Kevin was 36 years old, working 12-hour shifts 6 days every week at a manufacturing plant, earning $27 an hour, and everyone around him assumed he was finally doing well. Every Friday, his paycheck landed in his account. He looked at the balance with quiet relief, and for a brief moment he believed this would finally be the week something felt different. By the time the next paycheck arrived, the rent had been paid, the car payment had cleared, groceries had been bought, the gas tank had been filled, and somehow almost nothing remained. Kevin wasn't buying luxury watches, expensive vacations, or designer clothes, yet he couldn't explain why working 72 hours every week still left him feeling one unexpected bill away from starting over. That question stayed with him for months, and the answer turned out to have much less to do with how hard he worked than with a system most people never realize they're living inside. Kevin's monthly take-home pay averaged about $5,800 after taxes, which sounded impressive until the money quietly began disappearing into commitments he barely questioned anymore. Rent alone claimed $1,450 before the month had really started. His $480 car payment made sense because reliable transportation kept him employed, and the decision had seemed completely reasonable when he signed the paperwork. Another $210 disappeared into car insurance, followed by $85 for his phone, because both felt less like choices and more like permanent obligations. Utilities averaged another $220, and nothing about those bills felt excessive because they simply reflected the cost of keeping ordinary life running. I know what you're thinking, because Kevin wondered the very same thing. Where exactly was the rest of the money actually going if none of these expenses seemed irresponsible? Groceries quietly consumed around $650 each month, and even though he compared prices whenever possible, feeding himself still cost far more than it had only a few years earlier. Gas added another $320 because driving to work wasn't optional when 12-hour shifts often began before sunrise and ended long after dark. Coffee on the way to work, occasional lunches with coworkers, and a few dinners after exhausting weeks slowly became another $280 without ever feeling like major spending. Small subscriptions totaled about $55 each month, and individually every charge looked harmless enough to ignore. Then came birthdays, household supplies, replacing worn-out work boots, unexpected prescriptions, and countless ordinary purchases that quietly absorbed another $350 before Kevin even noticed. Looking at each expense by itself, nothing seemed reckless, but looking at all of them together told a completely different story about where financial pressure was actually coming from. This is where things begin to change, because Kevin slowly realized his paycheck wasn't disappearing through one terrible decision, but through dozens of perfectly normal ones. Behavioral economists often describe this as mental accounting, where people evaluate expenses one by one instead of seeing how every recurring commitment competes for the same limited income. The result is a strange illusion where each purchase feels affordable on its own, while the combined effect quietly removes nearly every opportunity to build meaningful financial resilience. Stay with me, because the really important part isn't that Kevin spent money. It's why every increase in income seemed to disappear almost as quickly as it arrived. Every raise made him feel safer for a few weeks, yet before long the new paycheck simply became the amount required to support his updated version of normal life. Without realizing it, Kevin had crossed into a pattern where higher earnings slowly raised expectations, recurring commitments, and comfort levels at nearly the same pace. The problem wasn't laziness or poor character, and it wasn't that Kevin refused to work hard, because very few people could sustain 72 hours every week for long without making enormous sacrifices. What Kevin was beginning to discover was that working harder and building wealth were not always the same process, and understanding that difference would completely change the way he looked at money. Kevin kept replaying the numbers in his head because they refused to make sense, and the harder he searched for one obvious mistake, the more he realized there wasn't one. His budget wasn't collapsing because of a single expensive habit, but because nearly every dollar already had a destination before his paycheck even arrived. That feeling has a name in behavioral economics, although most people experience it long before they ever hear anyone explain it. It's called the paycheck allocation effect, where income stops feeling like money to build with and starts feeling like money already spoken for. By payday, Kevin wasn't deciding where his money should go anymore, because those decisions had quietly been made weeks earlier through recurring commitments. Most people never notice this because nothing feels dramatic, and that's exactly why the pattern can continue for years without attracting much attention. Imagine carrying a bucket with 20 tiny holes instead of one large crack because every individual leak looks too small to worry about. Yet together they slowly empty the entire bucket. Kevin's finances work the same way, with dozens of necessary payments quietly competing against each other until almost nothing remained for his future self. Saving $200 occasionally felt productive, but replacing tires, paying medical bills, or fixing something at home often erased months of progress in a single week. That's why so many hardworking people describe themselves as running in place, even while their income steadily increases over time. Give me a minute because this next idea explains why simply earning more doesn't automatically solve that feeling. Human beings naturally adjust to new financial realities much faster than they expect, a process psychologists often call lifestyle adaptation. The first larger paycheck feels exciting because it represents possibility, but after several months, it quietly becomes the new definition of ordinary. What once felt like extra money slowly transforms into money that's already expected to cover a slightly larger version of everyday life. Kevin never consciously decided to inflate his lifestyle because most of the changes happen one reasonable decision at a time. A newer vehicle reduced repair worries, better internet made working and relaxing easier, and a few conveniences slowly became permanent expectations instead of occasional treats. None of those choices looked irresponsible by themselves, yet together they quietly increased the amount of income required just to maintain the same emotional comfort. This is where many people become confused because their standard of living improves while their sense of financial security barely changes. They aren't imagining the pressure because the pressure is real, but its source is often hidden beneath ordinary decisions instead of dramatic mistakes. And honestly, Kevin wasn't chasing luxury because he was simply trying to make life a little easier after spending 12 hours every day on his feet. The economy doesn't require people to make reckless decisions for financial stress to grow because ordinary recurring expenses are often enough. Housing, transportation, healthcare, food, insurance, and utilities have all become larger portions of many household budgets over time, leaving less flexibility than previous generations often expected. That doesn't mean every generation faces identical challenges, but it does explain why many workers feel they must earn more simply to maintain what already feels like a modest lifestyle. Kevin slowly realized he wasn't asking for extravagance because he was asking for breathing room, and those are two very different things. Once he understood that distinction, he stopped asking why he felt broke and started asking a much more useful question about where financial freedom actually begins. That new question changed everything, because Kevin was no longer trying to survive until Friday. He was trying to understand the difference between earning income and creating financial stability. Income pays today's bills, but financial stability depends on how much of today's income can remain available for tomorrow instead of immediately disappearing. At first, that sounded like a simple budgeting lesson, yet the reality was much deeper than writing numbers into different categories. Wealth is rarely built by one extraordinary decision because it usually grows through thousands of ordinary decisions, repeated consistently over many years. Kevin had spent years improving his ability to earn money, but almost no time improving the system that decided where that money ultimately stayed. Here's the strange part, because many people work incredibly hard to increase their paycheck while giving very little attention to increasing their financial margin. Financial margin is simply the space between what comes in and what must immediately go back out, and that space determines how many choices you actually have. Someone earning $60,000 with meaningful financial margin may have more flexibility than someone earning $100,000 whose income is already committed before payday arrives. That's why salary alone rarely tells the full story about someone's financial position, even though it's often the first number people compare. Kevin had always measured success by hourly wages because that was the standard everyone around him talked about. But wages describe earning power, while financial resilience describes what remains after life's ordinary responsibilities have been met. I thought the same thing until I began looking beyond income, because the numbers started telling a completely different story. Imagine two workers receiving the exact same paycheck every month, yet one has 3 months of expenses saved, while the other reaches nearly zero before every payday. On paper, their income is identical, but emotionally they experience money in completely different ways because one unexpected expense affects them very differently. The difference isn't always intelligence or discipline, because timing, obligations, family responsibilities, and previous financial decisions all influence the outcome. That's why comparing yourself to someone else's paycheck often creates more confusion than understanding. Kevin slowly stopped asking why someone earning slightly less appeared less stressed, because he finally realized he couldn't see their complete financial picture. Some people quietly carry very little debt, while others quietly carry years of financial commitments that never appear from the outside. Most conversations focus on visible income because invisible obligations are much harder to notice, even though they often matter far more. This is where things change, because Kevin's attention shifted away from earning another dollar and toward protecting the dollars he already earned. He began noticing recurring expenses with fresh eyes, asking whether each one continued serving a meaningful purpose instead of remaining there out of habit. Not every expense disappeared because many were necessary, but several had simply become automatic without being intentionally reconsidered. That small change didn't transform his finances overnight, yet it gave him something much more valuable than temporary relief, because it returned a sense of control. Instead of feeling like every paycheck was escaping faster than he could catch it, Kevin finally understood that small adjustments made consistently could slowly increase his financial margin. And the most surprising realization wasn't that money had become easier to earn, but that understanding its direction mattered just as much as understanding its amount. Kevin's situation hadn't magically changed, yet his relationship with money already felt different, because he was finally looking beyond the paycheck instead of only waiting for the next one. That shift may sound subtle, but throughout history, many lasting financial changes have started with a change in how people understood the systems around them, rather than a sudden increase in income. Economies have always rewarded production, but long-term financial resilience has depended just as much on preserving resources as generating them in the first place. This isn't a new idea because families, businesses, and even entire civilizations have struggled whenever every available resource was immediately consumed with nothing left to absorb unexpected change. Kevin realized the same principle applied to his own life because a paycheck without financial margin was like driving a car with no fuel reserve, where even a small detour could become a major problem. Stay with me because this is the part most conversations about money completely overlook. Working hard creates income, but systems determine what ultimately happens to that income after it arrives. If every future raise automatically becomes permission for larger recurring obligations, the feeling of financial pressure often returns even when earnings continue climbing. That's why some people spend decades chasing a number they believe will finally bring peace, only to discover that peace keeps moving farther away. Kevin wasn't trapped by one decision because he was living inside a pattern that quietly repeated itself every time his income increased. Once he recognized that pattern, he stopped treating every raise as extra spending power and started viewing part of it as an opportunity to strengthen his financial foundation. That didn't require perfection because life would always include unexpected repairs, medical expenses, family emergencies, and moments no budget could predict. What changed was that those surprises no longer represented the entire financial story, because Kevin was gradually creating room for them instead of reacting to each one as a crisis. The goal wasn't to eliminate every expense because that's neither realistic nor desirable in a normal life. The goal was to make sure today's choices didn't quietly remove tomorrow's options before tomorrow ever arrived. Give me one final minute because this may be the most important idea in the entire conversation. Many people believe they're falling behind because they aren't working hard enough, when in reality they're often carrying a financial structure that leaves almost no room for progress, regardless of effort alone. That's an important distinction because blaming yourself for a structural problem makes it much harder to recognize the parts you actually can influence over time. Understanding the system doesn't solve every challenge, but it does replace confusion with clarity, and clarity usually leads to better decisions than frustration ever can. Kevin still worked long shifts, still paid bills every month, and still faced ordinary financial responsibilities. Yet he no longer believed that another paycheck by itself would automatically change his future. Instead, he understood that lasting progress comes from the gradual combination of earning, protecting, planning, and allowing small improvements to compound over many years. Looking back, the biggest trap had never been low effort because effort was something Kevin had demonstrated every single week. The real trap was believing that hard work alone could overcome a financial system that quietly rewards intentional structure just as much as persistent effort. If Kevin's story feels familiar, it may be worth asking yourself not only how much you earn, but how much of that income still belongs to your future after every commitment has been met. Because the path toward greater financial resilience rarely begins with working harder alone. It often begins the moment you understand where your money is actually going and why that understanding changes everything.